Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Kirk, co-director along with Professor Dee Girolami of the Center for Law and the Human Person. And on behalf of the center, it's my privilege to welcome you to this evening's Tolle et Lege lecture, the final one of the year. This series takes its name from St. Augustine's account of his conversion. So when a voice in the garden commanded him to take up and read, taking this command to be from God, St. Augustine opened the scriptures and read the first passage his eyes fell upon from the letter of Paul to the Romans. So this is the quote that he read. "Not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual excess and lust, not in quarreling and jealousy. Rather, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the desires of the flesh." Reading those words, St. Augustine's long conversion was suddenly and completely accomplished. He was then baptized along with his friend and his son by St. Ambrose at the Easter Vigil in the year 387. So Tolle et Lege is a fitting name for a program devoted to the transformative power of text to encounter works of scripture, surely, but also in the Catholic intellectual and humanistic tradition that not merely inform, but also change the reader. That's the goal of this lecture series. So a little meditation on that. We are still within the Easter season, and we're celebrating the Lord's resurrection and looking forward to our own resurrection of the body, hopefully. So I think it's worth pausing over what St. Augustine's conversion required him to affirm. He was long attracted to Manichaeism, a philosophy that taught that matter is evil and the body a prison for the soul. And this dualism sort of conveniently relieved him of moral responsibility for sins that he struggled with and that he could then just attribute to this corruption of the flesh. So his conversion surely required a moral one, right? You may have heard the "Lord, make me chaste, but not quite yet" saying attributed to him. So it required a moral conversion, but it also required a philosophical conversion. And he had to come to see with the church that creation is good, that the body is good and integral to the human person, and that redemption is not escape from flesh, but its transfiguration. So our featured author in our last Tolle series, Flannery O'Connor, understood the body in precisely this way. So this is from a letter in a collection of her letters called The Habit of Being. She writes, "For me, it is the virgin birth, the incarnation, the resurrection, which are the true laws of the flesh and the physical. Death, decay, destruction are the suspension of these laws. I am always astonished at the emphasis the church puts on the body. It is not the soul," she says, "that will rise, but the body glorified." End quote. So the body is often the site of violation, and O'Connor filled her fiction with crime, violence, and the wreckage that people visit upon one another. But it is also the site of revelation. The body matters, which is why its abuse is so grave, and why those who suffer this violence in the body cannot be looked away from. This is what O'Connor's fiction forces us to see, and our speaker tonight has devoted her legal career to precisely the same sort of task. Professor Mary Graw Leary is a professor, of course, here at our own law school, a former federal prosecutor and one of the country's leading scholars on human trafficking and the exploitation of the vulnerable. Her scholarship is animated by a conviction that law is, in her own words, not a career, but a vocation of service to the victimized. Today, she brings that conviction into conversation with, I think, her fellow traveler, Flannery O'Connor. So please join me in welcoming Professor Graw Leary, who will present her lecture, "Screaming into the System." I just see now we may have a change of title here. "The Reciprocal Relationship Between Flannery O'Connor, Violence, and the Criminal Law." Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much, Professor Kirk, and thank all of you. It is the Easter season, but in law school, that means it's 3 weeks until exams. And the fact that any of you have come to talk about Flannery O'Connor is a testament to this great Catholic intellectual thinker and I think offers us some valuable lessons for our time. Before I get started, I've got a couple of questions and a few thank yous. Let me start with the thank yous. I want to thank the Center for Law and the Human Person for inviting me to give this talk so much, and Professor Kirk and G. Girolami. I also want to thank my research assistants who are critical in this talk, but this talk is part of a paper, and Alexa Finkelstein is here, as well as Kristen Diaz-Silvera is another one of my research assistants. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank the Flannery O'Connor Trust, Georgetown University, and Fordham University. 2 questions. How many of you are familiar with Flannery O'Connor? Would describe yourself as familiar with Flannery O'Connor? Okay, pretty great. How many of you have read The Partridge Festival, which will be a focus? Okay, super, very helpful. Last question. What's a nice Catholic Irish girl supposed to do when she finds herself landed in Athens, Georgia for a semester, and she's from New England? And being a nice Catholic girl, she's there for the semester, and she pulls up on her phone, masstimes.com, looking for where she's going to go to Mass on Sunday, and discovers the closest parish is 38 miles away. And she realizes, I am not in New England anymore. What to do? Well, that indeed was the question I found myself when I was in Athens during my sabbatical, and I did what any nice Irish Catholic scholar would do. I marched myself right on over to the Flannery O'Connor archives at Georgia State College and started researching her because I thought of myself as a fellow traveler and I needed to find somebody else in the state who thinks like me. And so I sat there, and I'm in the archives, and to all of the Irish women in the audience, I came to the conclusion quickly reading her papers and her articles and her drafts and her letters that we would have been friends, all of us. She was witty. She was from New England. I mean, she wasn't from New England. She was so not from New England. She was witty. She had that Irish wit about her. She was smart. She was funny. She was Catholic. She saw things that people don't normally see, and I would be laughing out loud there in the archives. And I had planned to research, as Professor Kirk alluded to, the influence of true crime on her work. What is the influence of criminal law on her work? Because, for those of you familiar, there's a great deal of crime, great deal of violence in her work. But that Flannery O'Connor, she's funny, she's tricky, and she often gets you thinking you're headed in one direction, but in fact, she's got a whole other place for you to end up. And that is exactly what happened to me. Because there I was reading her work and reading specifically about her challenges with trying to speak to a world which she felt wasn't hearing her. She was female. She was in the South. She was a Catholic. She was a writer in post-World War II, materialistic culture. And she was frustrated that people couldn't see what she saw, couldn't see the message that she was trying to give out. And I had a moment. And my moment brought me right back to, not where you think, brought me right back to late 90s Philadelphia courtrooms when I was a young prosecutor in a domestic violence courtroom. And I would be sitting there thinking, am I the only person in this room that thinks it's not okay to beat up your wife? And why did I think that? I'm sitting in a crowded courtroom. I got a judge who's just sustaining every objection, or on more than one occasion objecting himself, even though the rules of evidence allowed me to prove the abuse of this victim with excited utterances. But he didn't think he thought if the victim didn't show up, why are we even doing this? I got a court reporter who's looking at their watch saying, you're in between me and lunch. Why are you going forward with this case? My victim isn't there. My police officer's a little bit testy, but I'm looking at a stack of photos. Somebody with multiple injuries, 2 black eyes. And I'm thinking, I cannot be the only person in here who thinks it's not okay to beat up your wife. And so it came up. I had a vision there in the archives that we were both screaming into the system. Flannery O'Connor screaming into the world in which she was living. Don't you see some of these important messages that I have to say? And myself, or more importantly, you, young lawyers, law students, in a courtroom, you're the one who might find yourself screaming into the system to get people to see the truth. Hence the origin of this paper and of this talk. instead of a one-way relationship, Flannery O'Connor being influenced by the law, this project turned into something very different. This symbiotic relationship or reciprocal relationship, where I would like to suggest to you, yes, she's influenced by the law, and we'll talk about that, but she has something to offer us, something to offer today's advocate for the vulnerable. So this is my game plan. We're going to talk a little bit about vocation. It is the Catholic University of America, after all. And then I want to talk a little bit about the law's influence on O'Connor, focusing specifically on the Partridge Festival, because I think that will be most helpful, and offer you my theory here, which it's not only that she's influenced by true criminal events that took place, but she actually uses the law in a very unique and specific way in many of her stories as a real silent character. And I think it's significant that it's the law that is the trigger for violence, not just other forms of violence, but we will talk about that. And then the second part of the article and my talk will have to do with this idea that I think that O'Connor is alive and well today for all of us, but particularly for lawyers who are going to advocate on behalf of the vulnerable and marginalized, because we are faced with many of the same challenges that O'Connor felt at her time. And she has to wade us through the violence, through the carnage, to get the attention of a jury or a judge, to see the truth, to see what is really happening around them, and to take action for reform and protection. So let's get started. First thing I want to talk about is vocation. Flannery O'Connor was not just a writer. She didn't just want fame. She didn't just want to be successful. She looked at her writing as a vocation, as something more than a job, as something that consumed her, as something that, as she puts it here, clearly is a gift from God. So we use the word vocation today, not only in a religious sense, of course, but in a secular sense. She used it very much, I think, in the religious sense. She believed her gift for writing was indeed a gift, as you can see. And she said it comes from God. No matter how minor the gift is, the writer will not be willing to destroy it by trying to use it outside its proper limits. She wrote more explicitly in her prayer journal, which I would recommend for everyone, "Don't ever let me think, dear God, that I was anything but an instrument for your story, just like the typewriter is for mine." She very much viewed herself as trying to convey a message, a lesson or insight to the world on behalf of her creator. And what was that message? She specifically was interested in conveying to, again, this post-war world, this world which she saw becoming increasingly materialistic and secularized, the presence of grace and the power that presence of grace can have in the ordinary person's life. And one of the ways that, one of the ways that she did this was to really have to capture this attention, capture the attention from this audience. And she described her work, and this is a very commonly used quote of hers, and many of you, I think, are familiar with it. And she's trying to make someone who does not want to listen, listen, or who does not want to see, see. And what does she want them to see? She wants them to see grace, the presence of God, and its transformative force in her own life. Now, how does she do that? Well, she often used violence. And why did she use violence as a rhetorical tool? Let me be clear. She didn't, in my opinion, she didn't want to glorify violence. She didn't support violence or any of those things. As she writes about this, violence is never an end to itself. It's a force which can be used for good or evil. And she wrote, and again, many of these quotes are very familiar to you. She, in a speech to Hollins College, talked about she finds violence is capable of returning her characters to reality and preparing them for their moment of grace. For those of you who are Flannery O'Connor fans, you're probably quite familiar with one of her most famous stories, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, where she talks about at the end of that story, after all of this violence, there's that moment of grace for the grandmother where she has an opportunity to see that everyone is her child, even the man who has just killed her family and is about to kill her. She talks about that moment a lot, and usually that moment follows a period of great or significant violence. So that's how she uses violence in her stories to convey and be an active part of her vocation to bring grace to the reader. And I would like to suggest as well, okay, that she does this often by taking true criminal events. And so we're going to focus on one. And this criminal event is the inspiration for a story called The Partridge Festival. For those of you who haven't read it, I'll summarize it for you quickly and not accurately enough. I highly recommend you read it. It's pretty readable. It's a story of hers that's often maligned by critics, I feel unfairly, but I am a little biased here. And it centers around the return of a guy named Calhoun to his small Georgia town, where he's coming seemingly to visit his elderly aunts, but he's really there because he is going to expose their hypocrisy. The town is getting ready for the Azalea Festival, this giant festival. They're expecting thousands of tourists to come. It's going to be quite an event. And this whole town is wrapped up in the glory, the self-glorification of this festival. But a mere 5 days before, he is aware of a terrible murder that took place, where one of the town's well-known characters, marginalized people, came to the courthouse, the lawn in front of the courthouse, and he shot 5 dignitaries from the town, as well as an innocent person in the audience. And I think that innocent person is relevant. And he did this after a public humiliation, which we will talk about a little bit later. And Calhoun initially identifies with this character, Singleton. And he is coming there to do an expose and to show, he and another character, Mary Elizabeth, to show the world and to show this town that Singleton is merely a scapegoat for the town's obsession about materialism, etc. And the story ends when he and Mary Elizabeth go to the local mental institution where Singleton is being held, and they meet with him only to discover he is not a scapegoat, but in fact an extraordinarily violent person who proceeds to try to attack Mary Elizabeth, who avoids the attack, if you will. It's a good story. Well, it was very much modeled on an event that took place in Milledgeville, Georgia, which is Flannery O'Connor's hometown, where she spent the latter part of her life doing most of her writing. And for example, this photo on the left is Milledgeville Central State Hospital, which when Flannery O'Connor was growing up was the phrase apparently in Georgia was the mothers would threaten their children, quote, "I'm going to send you to Milledgeville." It was the largest mental institution in the state with at one point 12,000 people, and no, it was not built for that. The courthouse is this photo in the center, and the courthouse here is downtown Milledgeville. It's much better looking now. It's been rehabbed. And this picture, this case file to the right, is the case that this, the actual case that this Partridge Festival story is based on. And it involves a situation in Milledgeville where a marginalized citizen, Mr. Stembridge, who had been known in the town as a loan shark, kind of an oddity, people kind of looked the other way, but he, on the eve of their sesquicentennial celebration, marched into town and killed 2 of the most prominent citizens in the town, and then he killed himself. And if you read the descriptions of the town and the Partridge Festival, you'll see descriptions of the antebellum home where the aunts lived. And this looks a lot like the Klein Mansion, where Flannery O'Connor lived here for her time when she was at Georgia College for Women. It will describe this home as 5 blocks from downtown. This house is 5 blocks from downtown. And as I've alluded to already, she talks about a mental institution being very prevalent in the town, a mental institution very prevalent in her growing up. That murder took place in 1953, but I want to talk about a murder that took place earlier than that in 1949 because I think that matters. Mr. Stembridge, it turns out, has some frequency with violence, and in 1949, Mr. Stembridge and another accomplice showed up to collect some debts from one of the African-American folks for whom he was loan sharking money. And a young woman, an 18-year-old woman named Emma Jonikin, she intervened to try to help. And she was then met with being shot multiple times by Mr. Stembridge, ultimately dying after he, quote, put a gun in her stomach and shot her. The other woman with her, Mrs. Johnson, who was the father of the people that he was coming to collect money from, she was shot 4 times, testified at trial, and lived the rest of her life with a bullet in her pelvic bone. And even though he had an accomplice, that accomplice was never indicted in Georgia in 1949, 1950. But Mr. Stembridge was indicted, actually, for murder of this African-American woman. And an all-white male jury convicted him of manslaughter and sentenced him to 1 to 3 years to serve in jail. So in some ways, the system kind of worked, but in other ways, perhaps not. 1 to 3 years for an actual killing. But then in real ways, it didn't work at all, because as it turns out, Mr. Stembridge never spent 1 day in jail. He filed numerous appeals, all of which he lost, and he ultimately even went up to the Supreme Court in one case, and that case was dismissed. However, after everything seemed to have been exhausted, and it looked like there was no escape for him, he ended up in front of a new judge. And while we don't know what happened, and we've tried very hard to figure out what happened, the best we know is this. This new judge, 6 months left on, he had lost re-election, 6 months left on his time. Mr. Stembridge had a new lawyer who appears to have been, by some accounts, this judge's brother and law partner. And this judge just announced that he was granting a motion for habeas corpus and he would not have to go to jail. Now, the law students might say, I don't think that's how habeas corpus works. And it's not, just so we know, and it's a little bit unclear how that all happened. It's a little bit unclear why the prosecution didn't appeal. It's all a little bit unclear. But that is ultimately what happened. And why do I mention that? Because, of course, if the law had done what it was supposed to in the beginning of this tale, he might not have been able to commit that later subsequent homicide. But apparently, Mr. Stembridge decided that his lawyer, his initial lawyer, this guy, Mr. Ennis, who is Marion Ennis, photo here on the side, that he somehow tipped off the IRS about his financial misdealings. Did I mention he was a loan shark? I think I mentioned he was a loan shark, okay? So he and another lawyer, Pete Bevins, who was representing Mr. Stembridge's wife, who had shockingly applied for divorce after the homicide trial of her husband and alleged that he was committing domestic violence against her. He had decided that these attorneys were the ones who got him in trouble. And I'll spare you all of the stories. What really matters is he couldn't buy off, although he tried, the federal agents who were investing him for tax fraud. And so on May 2nd of 1953, it was 3 days before he was going to be sentenced, he got into his car. He drove to, you see the photo here of theater, but up above is where Mr. Ennis's offices were. He went in there and he shot him multiple times and killed him. He then exited that building, went down this alley that you see in the center picture, went upstairs there to Mr. Bivens's office and shot and killed him as well. It is then believed that he was headed to the courthouse. And so what I show you here are the courthouse steps, where it's commonly believed he was going in to kill the original judge who had actually convicted him. But the chief of police was coming up the stairs, and Mr. Stembridge turned the gun on himself and died. This was, as I said, days before this giant festival, and contemporary news articles from Newsweek talk about how this town went forward with their festival, and no one in the town wanted to talk about the incident that had occurred mere days before. So the parallels are really quite clear between these two, between the story and real life. In fact, she describes that the initial murder, she said Singleton appeared in the side door on the courthouse porch, depicted in this picture, with a silent automatic pistol, and he shot 5 of the dignitaries seated there, and by mistake, 1 person in the crowd. And I would argue to you that it is not insignificant that all of this took place in the courthouse, both what happened in real life and what happened in her story. The very center of town, the very place where there is supposed to be justice and protection, instead becomes, both in real life and in her fictional story, a place where there is danger and harm. Further, I would say she makes an indirect comment about this courthouse, because in the Partridge Festival, you will recall, a few days before the murder, Mr. Singleton was subjected to the following. She said 10 days before the festival began, he had been tried by a mock court on the courthouse lawn for not buying an Azalea Festival badge. Everyone in the town was supposed to buy one. During the trial, quote unquote, he had been imprisoned in a pair of stocks, and then once he was convicted, he had been locked in a jail together with a goat that had been tried and convicted for the same offense. But this jail was an outdoor privy borrowed for the occasion by the JCs. So she writes about this figure, this marginalized figure, if you will, being subject to what I can think is the most public of humiliations, right, on the courthouse lawn by the JCs as part of these folks. Such an extraordinary state-sanctioned humiliation not only failed to protect the public in the story, but I would argue may have functioned as the trigger for the events of violence that would follow. So I would make the argument here that we know that she's influenced by real-life crime, and a host of her other stories are influenced by the same, but she's making a specific use of violence here. And look, saying that Flannery O'Connor uses violence is like saying it gets humid in Washington in August, right? We all know this, right? But I think it's significant that the violence is often after the law has failed to protect someone. And I think that that is significant because what did she say she uses violence for? She's trying to shout to people who won't listen. She's trying to shock her audience. And I would argue that what could be more shocking or make someone feel more vulnerable than the law not being available to them to protect? She has written numerous times, and here's a couple of her of examples of it. She really finds that she is what she's writing is being read by an audience which puts little stock in either grace or the devil. And again, in her wit, you discover your audience at the same time in the same way that you discover your subject, and it is an added blow. The audience couldn't see what she could see. They couldn't see, in her view, the devil is active in the world, and God's grace is active in the world for you. And if to not be able to see that, she's trying to penetrate that audience. And how better to penetrate that audience than to have a world where there is no law, a world where there is no protection, there is nowhere to go. And I would suggest to you that that might be similar to a world where there is no God, to a world where there is no one to protect you, and how shocking that could be. And maybe that could be an awakening as you're reading some of her stories. So that's the first way I think that she's influenced by the law and uses the law. And I think she also uses the law to comment on its failure to protect the marginalized. Throughout so many of her stories, it is the marginalized who are harmed. The law plays a terrible role in many of her stories. In Wise Blood, it's full of corrupt police, etc. And The Life You Save May Be Your Own. There's a marriage taking place that is essentially human trafficking. I know you feel it's a tragedy, and Professor Leary always has to stick human trafficking in everything, but I am telling you, it is human trafficking in that case, where a woman is marrying off her daughter in order to get a handyman. These things are all happening. And many scholars have written about this. She has long had a concern for the outcast, for the hidden victimization in our culture, and the failure of the law to function as it should to reflect the inherent dignity that every human being has. I want to talk about one other trial as well This is a photo of the Stations of the Cross that are located at St. John the Evangelist's Cathedral in Savannah. And this is where Flannery spent her childhood years before ultimately moving to Milledgeville after a few detours. And you can't really see it in the picture, but I'm here to tell you, as someone who sat in that church, and I've seen a lot of Stations of the Cross, as I'm sure many people in the audience have, these things are intimidating. These are three-dimensional, big relief. And Flannery O'Connor, very famously at age 5, did two things. One, she announced she was calling her parents by their first name for the rest of her life. Very precocious child. And two, she absolutely refused to be going to the children's mass. She said, I'm not doing that. I am staying up here for the adults. So for about 3 hours every Sunday, she is up here looking at these kinds of images. And I would argue that's obviously an influence on her. But if you think about it, central to her life is her Catholicism. This is her vocation. And central to Catholicism, says the criminal law professor, is one of the great tragedies of corrupt criminal justice of all time, right? Where a corrupt judge decides to kill the innocent in order to advance his own goals. Where corrupt people in society offer false testimony in order for injustice to reign. That is central to her life, and I think that that is one of the other great influences of true crime, if you will, on her in her experience. Okay, and I've talked about this. This is just a thing that Flannery O'Connor, sure, many of you know the prayer of a Confederate soldier, and Flannery O'Connor, of course, is a proud Georgian. She would have known this prayer. It was discovered on a Confederate body in 1864, but I think this is one of her points. The very famous line in this prayer talks about, I asked for power that I might have the praise of men, and I was given weakness that I might fail the need for God. And I think a world in which the law is not protecting anyone is a world that is very scary and is a world that feels a lot like a world without a God. And that was one of her points. So that's one-way relationship. The second way of the relationship is, I think, what she can offer us. What to do as young lawyers who are screaming into the system. Well, I think we've got a shared philosophical framing of our vocations. On the left, you see some of the quotes that I've talked about how she looked at things, but many of us know that the law is not a job. The law's not just a career. The law is a vocation. Of course, we all know the quote from Justice Story, the law is a jealous mistress requiring long and constant courtship. It is not to be won by trifling favors, but by lavish homage. I like to think of the law as a jealous spouse, not mistress. And the reason I think that is because it rightly demands from us not trifling favors, but lavish homage. The law, those of you in the audience who are law students, you don't walk out of the office at 5, and you certainly don't if you're on trial. You are going to change people's lives. That is a vocation. That calls on you in the middle of the night. That calls on you in the weekend. It calls on you all of the time. And you can see this quote from Timothy Floyd, who talked about the practice of law as a vocation, talking about that God constantly calls us to serve God and our neighbors through our work as lawyers. And through the work to become the best people we can be, through the practice of law, we can become the persons who better serve God and neighbor. And I think that we are looking at careers in the same philosophical way. And I think that's particularly true for prosecutors. Many, as you know, I am a former prosecutor. I've talked about my work representing victims of domestic violence. I think this applies to every lawyer who's representing vulnerable people, but I think there's a particular philosophical overlap with Flannery O'Connor for the prosecutor. We talk about what is the prosecutor's job. It is to seek justice. And if you look at the National Prosecution Standard, it talks about representation and presentation of the truth. That is what a prosecutor is supposed to do. Yes, hold the guilty accountable, to be sure, but to make sure the innocent are protected from unwarranted harm and the rights of all participants, particularly victims of crime, are respected. So there's a philosophical shared vocation. And then many of my students, I've shared this quote with them, the entire criminal justice system turns on what? It turns on the integrity and the sensitivity and the character of prosecutors in that system. So like O'Connor, we need to approach our work in this vocational, channeling the Lord and his gifts for all that we do. Secondly, I think we have to, there's a shared practical framing for lawyers and for O'Connor, and that is this frustration she had with the hostile audience. I've showed these quotes to you before, but she finds that she's writing to an audience that doesn't really understand what she's trying to convey to them. Well, if you look even at sort of basic trial strategy, basic skills of the lawyers, what are we trying to do? We are trying to convince 12 people to do something that they generally don't want to do if you're representing the vulnerable. For a prosecutor, it's 12 people to judge another person and to possibly play a role in them losing their freedom. Jurors don't want to do that, and thank goodness they don't. And in fact, the system is structurally set up to make that hard for them to do with the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. But for those of you who are thinking about other careers representing vulnerable, it's the same idea. Getting a group of jurors to believe someone who might be marginalized, right? Who might be not as articulate, not as gifted in advocacy as the judge or the other lawyers. You're trying to get them to focus on what's important and to not pay attention to all the bells and whistles and shows that might be happening throughout the trial. In fact, in the research of juries, this is called defensive attribution, where jurors don't want to believe, the research tells us, don't want to acknowledge that crimes of violence have taken place, because to do so, actually there's a psychological effect where they then feel less safe. Because if they acknowledge that this crime took place, the effect it has on them as jurors. So the crowd is stacked against you, just like O'Connor felt. And she writes about this being a profit function. She's trying to get the audience to see reality, to get people to see the truth. She even calls them, she even in an interview talks about them as a hostile audience, okay? So there's a practical similarity to her screaming into the system and to us screaming into the system. And I think it's really captured here by one of the last quotes I have for you. And she described that this age, she felt, they feel less, okay? The previous times in history, she thought, and again, I think she was referring to a time where there was less secularization. She felt that they saw more, okay? And she says, when tenderness is detached from the source of tenderness, so when we don't have faith as a basis, its logical outcome is terror, and it ends in forced labor camps and in the fumes of the gas chamber. So that is how Professor Graw usually ends her criminal law classes. That is how Flannery O'Connor ends her stories, often on a downer, confusing, upsetting, but I'm not going to end it now. What can we do? What can we do? It's been 100 years since Flannery O'Connor's birth. We just wrapped up March 25th of 2025. And I would suggest to you Flannery is offering us a couple of things. First, as lawyers, what can we do? 6 lessons to take away from. First, investigation. She writes how the fiction writer must see the ordinary and earthly to discover the absolute. Flannery O'Connor famously worked and reworked her stories numerous times. Partridge Festival, 11 drafts, a lot even for her. And as lawyers, we must do that, constantly investigating. You know, the first person to lie to you is your client, my criminal defense lawyers tell me. I don't know if that's true, but constantly making sure, am I getting us to the truth? Do I know what happened? And if you're a prosecutor, that is really important. Am I seeing things as they are supposed to? And this ties into her second point about having a prophetic vision. See near things with their extensions of meanings, which I interpret as a lawyer to never stop having a critical eye for the work that you are doing, particularly as a prosecutor, because of the immense power that that position has. If a prosecutor gets it wrong, if they just follow the narrative without second-guessing themselves, The worst might happen. An innocent person may avoid conviction. So we constantly have to follow Flannery O'Connor's advice and to see near things and to see the extension of their meanings and to show the truth. I love this quote from her speech where she talks about the man in a violent situation reveals those qualities least dispensable in his personality. So often true if you're a prosecutor. Showing everyone, I know he's sitting there in a tie. Gosh, he looks really professional, doesn't he? I know that he's got the greatest lawyers of all time. And I know that the victim here is vulnerable and marginalized and less articulate. But my job is to show you the true person who is here and what truly happened. And additionally, speaking for the vulnerable, okay, she talks about having to make an experience alive for the reader. And so often that's what we need to do as attorneys in the trial. We have to put the jury in the room. It is our job to work with our victims, our witnesses, etc., so that they can experience what happened, so that they can know what happened, and they can cut through the show. Know your audience. Okay, she talked about, as I've said before, what's on the receiving end makes a difference, not in what the writer sees, but in the ways he shows it. Now, of course, Flannery O'Connor is fiction, and we are not about fiction and litigation. We are about truth. But know your audience. Know that they are probably not receptive to what you're trying to show them. Appreciate the obstacles that you're going to have to run up against. Prepare your witnesses for the obstacles that they are going to run up against. If you don't acknowledge the obstacles to truth, you can't deal with them and achieve justice. And then I would say, commit to this vocation of justice. Her vocation was to write and to bring presence and to bring grace into the presence of everyone's life. We must have this vocation to justice. And that means, as the district attorney rules say for prosecutors, to use your discretion to know when to protect, when to reform, when to convict. Like in her stories, we can't control the ending. And by that, I mean those of us reading them. And we think something's going to happen and something very different happens, okay? But we have to be confident. And if we do, we will be above reproach. And we will have the zeal of Flannery O'Connor. And this last picture, I think, really demonstrates for it. For those of you who know a little bit about Flannery O'Connor, but those of you who don't, I'll summarize. She died far too early at age 39. She suffered the last 13 years of her life with lupus, a great tragedy. That is the illness that took her father and kept her in constant pain. She had the opportunity to travel to Europe. She didn't want to go. Her aunt made her go. She took her mother. But she was excited to see the Pope, and in her letter, she talks about how she kind of lunged at him and made him a little nervous because she's very funny. And that's her right there behind there, seeing Pope Pius. But she brought with her a book. And here's a woman who in a few short years will die of lupus, who has suffered from a large portion of her life. And did she come to the Pope? And when asked and have an opportunity for ask a blessing, did she ask for good health? She did not. She asked him to bless her latest book, that it would be successful and would reach her audience. And I would suggest that if we as attorneys approach our work in the same way she approached her writing and ask that our work convey to the world his truth and his justice, we'll be doing okay. Thank you very much for your attention.